Thank you for inviting me. This isn't intimidating at all. Thank you so much for letting me talk about education. Now, I'm not going to try and cover some of the same ground that everybody else has, although they're very important points about indoctrination and sort of social justice theories within education. But what I wanted to do today was just to sort of think about some of the wider issues in education and some of the things that are talked about less. So, when it comes to education, I think everybody has an opinion. Everybody went to school, and so everybody thinks they know what education should be like, what teachers should be doing. And, you know, we've all had our experiences, positive and negative, and I can understand that. But there never has been a golden age of education. And sometimes we get sidetracked into debates about grammar schools and the types of schools. And I think that can... that overrides actually some of the more pressing problems that we have. There are always going to be opinions about the kind of education we should be giving. Should we teach knowledge? Should we teach skills? Should it be both? Should the curriculum be more or less academic? And what happens to those children who aren't so academic? And also, is the assessment system fair and equitable? And should we rethink it all again? Should we be more revolutionary about these things? And some of these ideas keep coming back into fashion. But I do think there are some key issues that affect all teachers, especially in the public sector. The main issue, I think, is the expectations on teachers. What can and should we expect from teachers? Take the current No More Exclusions campaign. Like so many initiatives, there's a real nobility in the intent, but the reasoning is flawed. The school-to-prison pipeline is what they call it, as though there's never been any crime and there's never been any criminal behaviour prior to the introduction of the universal education, or compulsory universal education. I mean, the sort of drift from reality couldn't be greater here. Those in schools know that permanent exclusion is really quite a difficult thing. And yet, those who write about these issues, you'd think from what they're saying that, we just exclude on a whim. That's just not true. So, too often in education, we have activists who have vast imaginations, but their solutions seem to be very simplistic, but also very unworkable. What makes the situation even more outrageous, particularly in terms of exclusions, is that unions such as the NEU, who should be protecting teachers, actually support these kind of ideas. They support the sort of interests of these external agencies rather than their own members. And it seems at times that some of the organisations that should be supporting us seem to think that there's nothing more that teachers should do other than to deliver their utopia. Then there's a kind of hyper-individualism that leads to parental and media outrage every time a school enforces any of its rules. And it happens every year. Come September, there's a whole spate of stories about, schools having rules, haircuts, uniforms, etc. And that's not to mention social media, where it seems that every bad idea that's ever been tried in education just seems to be rehashed yet again. No More Exclusions being a typical example of that. What's less reported, however, but more important, is the reality of working in and attending schools that do the opposite of this. So nobody really talks about those schools that are failing. Nobody talks about those schools where there is chaos in the classroom, where there is chaos in the corridors. Those just seem to be ignored. Pupils who want to sort of bend even minor rules in the name of human rights get coverage, yet this isn't matched by those whose learning is disrupted on a regular basis. No one really seems to think about what's going on in their long-term futures. And is it really right that certain children should have to be bulletproof and resilient in the classroom just to learn? We're now in a situation where those in the education system have known for quite a while that we really do have a recruitment and retention problem. The 5-year out-of-service rate is 31%. So a third of teachers leave 5 years after they trained. The cost of that is huge. It's not just huge in terms to us as taxpayers, it's huge to schools themselves. How can we expect to have a world-class education system if we don't have teachers in there in the long term? Who's supposed to be training the new teachers? Where does the experience come from? Also, if you just think about the school culture itself, this kind of high turnover all the time of teachers, it's just not healthy. And so there's this lack of stability all the time within the education system, and nobody really seems to have an answer for that. But it's not just the fact that these teachers leave and go off to do other things. It's the fact that you just don't have that formal and informal professional development of teachers that is much needed. Then there's the issue of politicisation. And as far as I'm concerned, it's never loomed larger. If anything, I think we're only at the beginning of the changes that the activists put in place during the pandemic. The guidance from different sources, the GFE, government ministers, local authorities, external agencies, it's all really contradictory. No matter what you think about it, the fact is that we're sort of now subject to all sorts of guidance, and it's not clear what's really going to happen. But it is clear that it is going to be teachers who are going to be facing the criticism and the critique, and any kind of judicial review will revolve around them because they're the ones in the classroom. Neither is it clear what Ofsted intend to do. So there was, I think it was quite optimistic what happened with the American school in London, but it didn't set a precedent. And organisations such as Don't Divide Us have had lots of worrying reports from parents and people within schools as well to suggest that critical race theory is gaining more ground within schools, as well as other social justice activist theories. However, I also think that what I don't want to see, and what I hear sometimes, is those people who are fighting it seem to think that actually, if they can't beat them, they want to join them. So, in some ways, they seem to think that actually the classroom can be a place where they also talk about their views and their values. And that's not necessarily a problem per se, but what I don't want to see is a situation where, as a class teacher, all I'm doing is basically, sort of mediating between two sets of activists. I don't think that's the solution. The solution to indoctrination and ideology is not more indoctrination and more ideology. Also, I think we need to think quite carefully about the fact that actually the principles that we set in place are there for the future. As has already been mentioned, recent events in Leicester show that actually we need to fight against this idea that historical or even present wrongs can be, righted in the classroom or in the streets. It's not going to happen. We need to be very careful when we're teaching that we are fair and that we are giving a truthful representation of events and not just submitting to whatever ideological stance is being taken. Particularly these days, the fact of the matter is, I think certainly, when it comes to critical race theory, there seems to be this sort of blind spot where people don't realise that there's YouTube, there's a world out there which children can access. We can't simply give one side of the story, and yet that is what's being forced upon certain teachers. So there are real challenges post-pandemic as well, such as building the relationships between schools and teachers and pupils again. And we're going to be counting the cost of lockdown for quite a while too. For example, it's already known that there's going to be an increased need for, that there is more speech and language problems that are going to be that are the result of the pandemic that we're going to have to deal with. And where is the money going to come from to deal with some of these problems? Also, there is a higher level of persistent absence, and that can only bode ill for the future, because what it means is that we're not getting children in and we're not getting them literate. And the gap between advantaged and disadvantaged pupils just grew over that pandemic. And so these are legacies that we need to contend with. What I think we really need, and the SDP does offer this, is a more bold vision for the education system. No, we can't all have prizes, the sort of Melanie Phillips sort of quote. But at the same time, we need to make sure that the vast majority of pupils are equipped with the knowledge and skills they need. We also need to make sure that for teachers and schools that we do have coherence between national and local guidance. People, right now you've got sort of, like I said, the GFE saying one thing, local authorities saying another, and we're just caught in the middle, and that can't keep happening. But most of all, what we really need is a joined-up system, which is properly funded and which supports teachers to enable as many pupils as possible to succeed in the future. Thank you.